mean, we cannot miss our seat.
No, we can't miss the seat.
You used to be the president.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Thierry Martin. I'm a TV news anchor based in Berlin, and I'm delighted to be back here in Abu Dhabi for the World Policy Conference. Welcome to the session on the future of Europe. The full title of our session is The Future of Europe After the Ukraine War and Trump's Election. Well, Trump, of course, has been re-elected, and with all likelihood, he will become president for the second time in January. On January 20th, he's due to be inaugurated. But we need to remind ourselves that the Ukraine war is very much still ongoing, right? There are massive casualties there every day, and nobody really knows how or when it's going to end. We need to be very clear about that. Yesterday, Ukraine reported being hit by over 90 missiles, around 200 drones. It was attacked again overnight, most of that targeting the country's energy infrastructure, with the temperatures dropping below zero. So we're not really after the Ukraine war, and it's a bit premature to talk about it. We will be talking about how that might play out. There is a lot of speculation, of course, in the context of Trump having just been re-elected, because he, of course, says he's going to end it very quickly. In any case, we're gathered here at a pivotal moment in Europe's history. The war in Ukraine has shaken the foundations of Europe's security and redefined the continent's relationships with its neighbors and its allies. Meanwhile, the return of Trump as US president signals a potential recalibration of transatlantic relations with ripple effects across trade relations, defense, and climate cooperation, things we've been talking about here already. Now, Europe faces several pressing challenges. I'm just going to mention three, and then we'll get things going. Number one, I would say, is security. The war in Ukraine has underscored the vital importance of NATO while raising questions about Europe's strategic autonomy. Number two, economic realignment. There's a lot on that yesterday, fascinating discussions. Sanctions, energy diversification, global trade tensions demand a rethinking of Europe's economic strategies. And we got challenges surrounding unity and leadership in Europe as well. That's no secret. The world is growing more polarized. Europe must find a way of navigating its internal divisions if it hopes to retain credibility as a global actor. Now, these are some of the issues we'll explore this morning with a distinguished panel of experts. Each of them brings unique insights into Europe's challenges and opportunities. It's my great pleasure to introduce them now. Starting here, and I'll be jumping around a bit. Yann, Coatanlem, I hope I'm getting this roughly right. He's the co-founder of the neuro-powered media company GlassView and a board member of the Paris School of Economics. He's also president of Club Praxis, and in that role he has worked to leverage big data to rethink Europe's tax and welfare systems. Yann is the author of Capitalism Against Inequalities, offering transformative ideas for policymaking. I think it just came out last year. Zaki Laïdi, two down there, you can see him, was no stranger to the World Policy Conference. He was, until very recently, just last week, I believe, a personal advisor to the EU's High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security. He's been a professor at Sciences Po for over 2 decades now and has advised French prime ministers and EU officials on global trade, politics, and Europe's strategic positioning. And he's the founder of something called Telos. 2 down from me, Vuk Jeremić is the president of the Center of International Relations and Sustainable Development, a former Serbian Minister of Foreign Affairs. He's also served as the president of the 67th UN General Assembly, where he played a key role in advancing the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Vuk is a professor at Sciences Po and editor-in-chief of Horizons magazine. Norbert Röttgen, second from the end down there, is a senior member of the German Bundestag and a veteran of German foreign policy, having chaired the Foreign Affairs Committee in the Bundestag. He still sits on that committee. He's a former federal minister for the environment. I'm not sure you remember me being with you in Copenhagen at the COP in a background talk many years ago. I recall Norbert has been instrumental in shaping Germany's approach to sustainability, transatlantic relations, and European unity. And his party may very well end up leading Germany again come February. The polls point to that. In any case, Hubert Védrine, down at the end, is the founder of Védrine Conseil and France's former Minister of Foreign Affairs. He's played a key role in shaping France's geopolitical strategy and has contributed to reflections on NATO's future as part of the NATO 2030 group. So we have an extraordinary concentration of expertise on topics hugely relevant to Europe's future, and we're going to hear about that. Each panelist will deliver some opening remarks at the beginning. Following that, I will pose a question or two to each panelist, and then we'll open the floor to questions from all of you. So be thinking about questions as we go along. So let's have our opening statements. We've agreed on 6-7 minutes each. Of course, they don't have to use all that time. Discussion is much more fun. We'll start here with Yann.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me, Thierry. I've been an economist. I'll start with the economy, if you may. It is now widely accepted that Europe cannot retain its prosperity, its standard of living, and its influence on the world if it cannot fix its economy, right? Now, what do we do about it? Well, it seems like an almost impossible task. So maybe in order to propose concrete solutions, I will highlight just one key diagnosis of the Draghi report that has been mostly overlooked. And first, what is the main takeaway of the Draghi report? Well, it is that the European economic performance is lagging the US. And you can see on this graph, the US had an extraordinary run in the last 10 years. You have a group of countries in the middle, and you have countries like France, Italy, Canada, that have gone nowhere in the last 10 years, that have remained essentially flat. So that's a problem. The second takeaway, which I think is even more important, is that most of the gap between the US and Europe comes from actually the technology sector. I think that's something we need to be very well aware of. And that kind of becomes clearer when you look at this graph, which looks at the level of investment in research and development. And if you look at traditional industries outside the tech sector, you see the numbers are comparable, right, on both sides. If you look at public investments, the numbers are also comparable, at least on a relative value. But the big difference is for the high-tech sector, where the US dominates by a factor of 5 to 6. And that's a big takeaway, right? So what is so special about tech? Well, it's the fact that you fail all the time, right? You fail all the time in an industry that changes at a fast pace as well. So imagine yourself, you're a runner, right? You have to go very fast because you have competition, but there are so many obstacles, you fall every few meters as well. What's the solution? The only solution is to get back quickly on your feet. And unfortunately for European companies, that's not something you can do right now. Let me take a very concrete example. If you look at Meta 2 years ago, right? Meta changed their name from Facebook to Meta because of the metaverse. Well, they realized 2 years ago that the metaverse was not going anywhere. So what did they do? They fired 20,000 people, about a quarter of their staff. They rehired in a few months thousands of engineers with a more AI profile, and then invested tens of billions of dollars in physical capital, all the AI equipment that you need. So in terms of duration, it was executed in a few months, and in terms of cost, it was also a few months of the total compensation of the workers that were laid off, right? So big agility here. If you contrast that with the European situation, so take the big tech companies, SAP, Nokia, Ericsson, they announced about the same time significant restructurations, but at the same time, they announced accounting provisions over several years, right? So you see a few months on one side, a few years on the other side, you have an order of magnitude difference. And then when you value a company, you're an investor and you value a company, well, you know, obviously the same project that is profitable in the US becomes non-profitable in Europe because of these restructuring costs, right? Oops, sorry. So, so the conclusion at this stage that employment protection laws choke the profitability of high-risk projects that, again, fail very often. So Mario Draghi says exactly that in his report, and I quote, and you have it here. EU companies face higher restructuring costs compared to their US peers, which places them in a position of huge disadvantage in highly innovative sectors characterized by the winner takes most dynamics. So as a consequence of all that, what do European companies do? Well, they avoid disruptive innovation, right? They avoid to be near the technology frontier. And you see what you see on the screen, which is that, and it's very striking, if you compare the US and Europe, you see that in the US, companies essentially invest in high-tech R&D, when in Europe, you invest mostly in old-style industries, right? And that's a very striking difference. Now, even more shocking graph is the following, and I think it puts things in perspective very well. If you look at relatively young companies, less than 50 years, with companies of a significant size, more than $10 billion of market cap, here's what you get, right? High-tech in green, so the big rounds on the US side are what we call the Magnificent Seven. And then you have Europe, which is so little, and Asia actually would be much bigger, right? So that's really striking. So what do we do about it? Well, what we discussed with Draghi, and we are proposing to national governments and the European Commission, is that let's not necessarily copy the US style of employment protection, but let's use the best practice in Europe, and that would be something like Switzerland or Denmark. So we think in particular, if you could adopt the Danish flexicurity, but maybe limit it to the top 5 or 10% of employees, the kind of area where you're going to hire your highly qualified engineers, then you're in business. And it's almost a win-win situation because the rest of the population is not going to go in the streets. In fact, they may be pleased with the idea that the privileged people are going to suffer a bit more. And at the same time, you give European companies more blood and the ability to really regain this agility I was talking about and the ability to really react in a few months and not in years, right? So that's the idea, and I'll stop here.
Yann, just to get us kind of back to where we started I'm wondering about the ideas that you just put forth there, and they are really interesting. I love that map that you showed up of blue and white with European versus US companies in terms of going from scratch to public. But I'm just wondering, getting back to our topic with Europe after the Ukraine war and Trump, how do you see Europe's competitiveness moving forward, particularly in the tech sector, being influenced by those two developments? Do you see any changes coming about, or is this going to be business as usual?
Well, it's going to make the European situation even more complex, right? Because budgets will be more restricted. So I think governments, as usual, will have to tackle several tasks at the same time, and it's very difficult. Cost of energy clearly is likely to remain high in Europe because of all these conflicts, all these tensions. And yeah, that's going to impact the business landscape. big time, right? So hence the need to start structural reforms.
Okay.
And you can do that in any kind of context, right? War, not war. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, so I mean, Europe's competitiveness will be, of course, influenced by both these developments and already has. So, okay, let's move on then. Zaki, Laïdi, would you like to begin?
Yeah, thank you. Well, I will start talking about the main issue, which is Ukraine. We were here 1 year ago with virtually the same panelists, including the anchorman. And I would like to just insist on what has changed and what has not changed since last year. So what has not changed is, from a European perspective, a strong alignment with Ukraine. We are the main provider of economic and military aid to Ukraine, and I insist on that point. We are the main provider of economic and military aid to Ukraine, ahead of the United States. So our contribution is huge, and it will certainly remain important. Second, there is no doubt that Russia will remain, for the EU, a major security threat for the next years. And all the assessment made by the military in Europe conclude that Russia will reinforce its military capacity, and therefore the Europeans have, of course, to avoid any kind of military confrontation with Russia. It would be irresponsible, but we need to deter Russia. And in order to deter Russia, we need to ramp up our military effort on a national basis, but we have to do it also collectively. We are now talking about reaching not simply the 2% target, but the 3% target. But this is not going to be enough if we do not start working seriously together. So there are a lot of discussions, a lot of projects on the table, very huge projects on the table, in order to ramp up the military effort of the European Union. At the same time, we all know the obstacles on the way, including bilateral cooperative programs, such as the French and the German programs, which are not in a very good shape. So this is what has not changed. What has changed is, first, the fact that we, of course, have to realize that Russia didn't collapse, that the regime in Russia has adapted itself to a war economy, in spite of the huge problem the Russian economy is facing. So we cannot underestimate those difficulties. They're huge, but at the same time, the Russians have been able to adapt, and the regime is not on the verge of a collapse. It has adapted itself to a war economy. I mean, there are very, very different ways. On the military front, we are facing what I call a sort of bloody stalemate. A bloody stalemate in the sense that the Russians are advancing in the Donetsk very slowly, but they are advancing. and they are advancing at a huge human cost. In October, Russia lost 1,500 soldiers during the month of October. It's the highest casualty since the beginning of the war, which means that the progression has a huge cost. But the Russians have a huge capacity to generate new forces. And if they lose between 1,000 or 1,500 soldiers a day, they are able to generate at least 25,000, 30,000 soldiers a month. Moreover, the Russian regime had been able to overcome the political obstacle created by a possible draft. And if you look at the composition of Russian forces in Ukraine, you see that 70% of the soldiers are engaged on the basis of contracts. They are contractors, I mean, people who have a contract. You have convicts, 12%, and you have only 7% of people who have been drafted, which means that the political pressure from the population on the regime is lower. Moreover, those who get money to go to war, their life expectancy is limited, around 3 weeks or so, but the families get the money. And there is a very interesting chart which shows the evolution of saving rates in Russia, but also in Tuva and in Buryatia. And you see that the saving rates are skyrocketing in Buryatia and Tuva, whereas on average, the saving rates in the rest of Russia is, increasing, but not that much. Which means that politically, the Russian regime had been able to adapt itself. On the military front, and I mean, I can develop this point, but very quickly, the Russians have been able, and this is something which is not mentioned a lot in the publication and in debate in the press, the Russians have acquired a formidable capacity to master the EW, electronic warfare.
Sorry, we need to wrap up a little, so we can get everyone.
Now, for us as Europeans, we all know, and everybody knows, to be frank, that there would be no military solution to the conflict in Ukraine. I think that everybody agrees with this. Now, we need to support the Ukrainians in order to face the Russians in a possible political negotiations. When I was with the High Representative in Kyiv 3 weeks ago, we discussed the different scenario. I would not enter into details, but of course we need to support the Ukrainians to face the possibility of a political negotiations.
Thank you very much. You were just in Ukraine, as you mentioned, just a couple of weeks ago. You sat down with Volodymyr Zelensky, the president of Ukraine. I presume Joseph Borrell was also there with you at that meeting. Maybe just give us one anecdote from that meeting, very quickly, what you learned.
Well, I will not disclose the content, but what I can say is that he was very appreciative of the role of the European Union, and of course they are interested in. But this is on the public record. Joining very quickly NATO. I don't think it's going to happen. their participation to the European Union is progressing quite well, but it doesn't mean that it's going to take place within five years. So very appreciative on the role of the EU in general and in detail.
Said like a true veteran diplomat. Very good. Hubert Védrine.
I speak in French.
Okay. Go ahead, you can begin.
Non, mais j'attends que tout le monde soit branché. Alors, ma première remarque, c'est que depuis une trentaine d'années, je pense que dans les réunions où on raisonne de façon économique globale, la mondialisation, on n'a jamais rien vu venir en matière géopolitique. Donc l'approche économique globale est aveugle en matière géopolitique. Deuxième remarque très simple, je pense que les Européens, c'est vrai des Canadiens aussi, sont les plus mal préparés au choc Trump. Trump, c'est comme une sorte d'astéroïde qui s'écrase sur le continent européen et qui va peut-être faire disparaître les dinosaures européens, c'est pas sûr. Il y aurait peut-être l'autre hypothèse. Alors, le choc Trump, il faut distinguer les domaines dans lesquels les Européens vont devoir préserver leur unité. Donc en matière commerciale, en matière de lutte contre le protectionnisme, les traités sont clairs. La Commission a une vraie compétence. Elle fait un très bon travail. Là, il s'agit de préserver l'unité. En théorie, existe, même s'il y a des débats entre Mme von der Leyen et Mme Lagarde sur la bonne ligne. Bon. Mais naturellement, Trump va essayer de diviser les uns et les autres. Il va jouer les pays les uns contre les autres. Donc on verra. Et les domaines dans lesquels il n'y a pas d'unité européenne en matière de défense et de stratégie, ce sont les Européens qui ont demandé aux Américains, après la guerre, de les protéger. Dans la tête des Européens, ça n'a pas changé. Dans la commission sur l'avenir de l'OTAN que vous avez citée, dans laquelle le président Macron m'avait demandé de représenter la France, à chaque réunion, l'ensemble des autres me demandaient d'arrêter de parler d'autonomie. Parce que l'autonomie voulait dire rupture, abandon. Bon, sans arrêt. Alors, et donc, là, on ne parle pas de l'Union européenne, on parle des Européens de l'Alliance. Et si Trump va au bout, on ne sait jamais avec Trump, on verra. Donc s'il va au bout de ses projets, de ses annonces, il y aura un débat très 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 compliqué entre l'Allemagne, la Pologne, la France, l'Italie, la Suède et la Grande-Bretagne. On n'est pas dans l'Union là, il s'agit des Européens de l'Alliance. Alors je sais bien que là, en Europe, il y a eu un choc, Poutine a beaucoup fait pour ça, il y a une prise de conscience. Il y a un commissaire pour la défense, mais c'est pour l'industrie de défense, ce n'est pas pour la décision stratégique. Donc c'est vrai que les esprits sont différents, au prix d'ailleurs d'une confusion, parce que dans les discours en Europe, on mélange totalement ce qui relève de l'Union, de l'OTAN, les niveaux nationaux, etc. Bref, dans le choc Trump, il y a la guerre commerciale. Là, on va voir si les Européens restent homogènes dans 6 mois, dans 1 an. Il y a la question écologique. Est-ce que les États-Unis vont devenir un pays voyou, un voyou écologique? Je pense qu'il faut maintenant utiliser ce terme. Le Moyen-Orient, en réalité, la seule vraie question, parce que Netanyahou a déjà les mains libres, en vrai, depuis le début. La seule question, c'est est-ce que Trump va l'encourager à attaquer plus l'Iran, ou le laisser faire? Et l'Ukraine, c'est plus compliqué, parce que s'il met en œuvre, plus compliqué pour les Européens, compliqué pour les Ukrainiens. Si Trump met en œuvre son projet, et qu'il gèle le conflit, il ne peut pas se permettre, même en étant Trump, de dire simplement « j'arrête le soutien à l'Ukraine ». Parce que sinon, il n'est plus capable de dissuader la Chine, ni qui que ce soit. Donc il est obligé d'imaginer quelque chose. Mais comme l'Amérique ne veut pas mettre l'Ukraine dans l'OTAN, Biden ne voulait pas, Trump encore moins, il va demander aux Européens de le faire. sauf s'il y a une pression générale. Tout le monde a dénoncé le nouveau Munich, il y aura 3000 articles pour dire ça. Est-ce qu'ils pourront obtenir de l'Amérique qu'elle s'engage quand même, plus directement? Mais il demandera aussi quelque chose aux Européens. Que vont décider les Européens sur l'entrée de l'Ukraine dans l'Union européenne? À ce moment-là, qu'est-ce qu'ont fait des autres candidats qui attendent depuis des années? Sinon, est-ce qu'on arrive à faire bouger les États-Unis sur l'entrée de l'Ukraine dans l'OTAN? Et qu'est-ce que ça veut dire en vrai en termes d'engagement, article 5? Ou alors, plus compliqué encore, l'Ukraine n'est pas dans l'OTAN, mais Trump dit c'est à vous, Européens, enfin les pays qui ont une armée, ou la dissuasion, d'assurer la garantie. Parce que la garantie de sécurité, ça veut dire dissuasion, ça veut dire menace en fait. Donc il n'y a pas de gel du conflit en Ukraine, s'il n'y a pas une menace sur Poutine, en disant on arrête, on va s'occuper des 2 tiers de l'Ukraine pour les développer, mais vous ne pouvez pas réattaquer. Donc dans tous ces cas, ça retombe dans les mains des Européens qui n'ont pas de position homogène avant, en dépit des efforts de la Commission, en dépit des efforts des responsables de la pêche, qu'il y a eu beaucoup de travail intellectuel, on va dire, depuis des années. Mais ça nous met devant des discussions, des questions énormes. Et je ne parle pas de la question de la compétitivité, parce que c'était très bien traité. On sait bien que la réponse serait le plan Draghi, ou l'État. Bon, mais là, ça nous renvoie à la situation dans chacun des pays. Donc voilà l'essentiel de ce que je voulais dire. J'ajoute une remarque qui est que dans le vote aux États-Unis, au nord de la conjoncture, Mme Harris n'était pas prête, et Trump est une véritable bête de scène. Bon, il y a l'exfoliation conjoncturelle. Mais du côté du peuple américain, il y a une demande de coup d'arrêt à la mondialisation qui va trop loin, et à mon avis, il y a une demande de coup d'arrêt au progressisme américain, qui existe depuis les années 60. Sinon, on ne peut pas comprendre le vote des latinos, par exemple. Trump a quasiment 48% du vote latino. Alors, quel est le rapport avec notre sujet? C'est qu'en Europe, puisqu'on s'est dit comment l'Europe va réagir, il y a des gouvernements de coalition à peu près partout, avec beaucoup de partis de gauche, dont la plupart d'entre eux ont abandonné le peuple. Quand le peuple est idiot, il ne comprend rien sur l'Europe, il ne comprend rien sur la mondialisation, etc., etc. Et le peuple, il veut maîtriser les flux migratoires et les élites sont contre. Donc le vote Trump, à mon avis, annonce une discussion difficile en Europe, dans les partis de gauche, chez les progressistes, sur quel est notre rapport à la majorité. Parce que ce sont des partis qui ont joué, pas uniquement les minorités, la partie radicalisée des minorités. Donc, alors le lien avec le sujet, c'est que ça peut contribuer à affaiblir beaucoup de gouvernements en Europe au moment où on a besoin, au contraire, qu'ils soient homogènes, solides, stratégiques, etc. Donc le résumé de ma pensée, c'est que le choc Trump peut achever de paralyser, désagréger l'Europe, en dépit des efforts impressionnants accomplis ces dernières années, que Zaki, Laïdi rappelle régulièrement, il a raison, ou l'inverse. Ou l'inverse. Donc est-ce qu'en 2025, on va voir surgir à travers la tension, c'est comme vous savez, pour fondre les métaux, il faut des forges à très haute température. Est-ce que ça va créer quelque chose d'entièrement nouveau? Auquel cas, il faut y réfléchir tout de suite dans les domaines où ce n'est pas acquis à l'avance, c'est-à-dire sécurité, défense.
Very good. Thank you very much. I have many questions about what you just said, and I'm sure we can pick up on them as we proceed. But out of respect for time, I'm going to jump straight ahead to Jeremić.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be back at the World Policy Conference. I want to thank Thierry not just for this invitation, but also for all his support and guidance that I have enjoyed throughout these years. I'm out of politics. I've been in politics for about 20 years, but now I'm out of politics, and it's easier to talk, especially about issues of such delicacy and significance once you're out of political sphere. But I want to say that, I mean, at the beginning, this is a truly tragic war. And I say this from a perspective of someone from Yugoslavia, former Yugoslavia, who comes from a mixed background. I'm half Serbian, half Bosnian, and my wife is half Croatian, half Montenegrin. So we've lived as a family through various facets of tragedy related to the breakup of Yugoslavia, and there are many parallels that one can make to this particular conflict, and that's why I say it's exceptionally tragic. Human loss, but actually decades of scars that will be very, very difficult to heal is something that I have in mind. But Thierry said yesterday that this is reality as it is and reality as it should be communicated directly, that this is the logic of this conference. So I hope everybody will forgive me for saying how I view the reality without like too many gloves. This war is coming to an end. And this war is coming to an end, in my opinion, soon. I might not be right in a sense that it might not be terribly soon, right? So it could be a little later. It could be that the discussions between Mr. Trump and Mr. Putin and whoever else, I'm actually not aware of anybody else being at this point involved. I know that some messaging is currently going on between Moscow and Washington. I have not heard of anybody else being included in this circle. So it may not be soon, it may take another month or a year. In my opinion, it'd be tragic because the end will be the same. It'll be only just after another 100,000 people die. So I very much hope that it comes to an end sooner rather than later. Of course, for as long as it lasts, and if it, God forbids, escalate, I think it could not be the same. It could be much worse. It could be a catastrophe involving the weapons of mass destruction and whatnot. But let's hope we don't get there. Let's look at the gray rhino that is moving towards us. It's not a black swan, it's a gray rhino that is walking relatively slowly but steadily and inevitably towards us. And this is the inauguration of President Trump, and then President Trump acting decisively on what he had said was one of his priorities as he was running for president. Mr. McCarthy yesterday said President Trump was elected to secure the border, to get inflation under control, and to end wars. And he will deliver on it. If that's true, and I believe it is, then soon we are going to face the end of the war, or at least the end of the hostilities. Therefore, I'm worried when people talk about, whilst of course I do understand, ramping up defense spending and at the same time talking about how Russia transformed into a war economy. I just sincerely hope that Europe doesn't try to transform itself into a war economy, because that's, in my opinion, a recipe for disaster midterm, if not earlier. I really hope that there's going to be peace in 2025. And then one thing about the future of Ukraine, I think it is manifestly obvious that Ukraine is not going to be a member of NATO. Biden did not want it, as Mr. Védrine said, and Trump is not going to want that either. But there's EU. And I wholeheartedly hope that the European Union is not going to repeat the same mistake with Ukraine, the mistake that the EU did with regard to us in the Western Balkans. Because the European Union is not going to be ever willing to accept Ukraine as a member, as a fully fledged member. And you know what? I have so many friends in Ukraine. I have so many friends in Georgia. I have some friends in Moldova as well. they genuinely believe that they're joining the European Union, and actually soon. So when you say very diplomatically, it's not going to be in the next 5 years. I understand the diplomatic language. I was involved in diplomacy. But I'm talking about the perception in the publics. I think it is extremely important that you set the expectations straight with them so that a constructive relationship can be forged in the aftermath of this war. When I talk to my friends from Ukraine and Georgia, they say, oh, well, do you think that we're going to join by 2030? I said, no, I don't think it's realistic. I said, like, you know, guys, I think we in the Western Balkans, we're going to join before you. I said, oh, really? When is that going to be? And I say, never. And it's a semi-joke. Because, you know, guys, you know your European stuff better than I do. You know how the European Council works. You know how complicated things are. I just cannot foresee your taking in any new fully-fledged members into the European Council before you change certain ways inside the European Union. Decision-making rules and this and that. Like, are you going to give Serbia a veto in the European Council? I wouldn't bet my last dollar on it, right? I can recall some conversations with my European friends who were very upset about Hungary under certain, you know, conditions. Serbia must be worse, by definition, right? So I think that a lot of emphasis, in my opinion, ought to be placed on the European political community that was launched with the great support of France and President Macron. I think that ought to be given more effort and more work than currently is, and to please set expectations straight. The new Commissioner Kallas said in her hearing, we are going to make sure that Ukraine wins this war. And von der Leyen said, Ukraine is going to be a member of the European Union. Neither of those two statements, in my opinion, have a very high likelihood of being materialized, of happening.
Okay.
So I hope that for the sake of future relations between Ukraine and Europe, there is a different diplomatic and political dynamics in that relationship.
Thank you very much. That was a clear statement there at the end. What all of you had to say is so utterly compelling and interesting. I'm so disinclined to stop you from talking, but we do need to make room for everyone. And we will conclude the opening remarks with Norbert Röttgen, and hopefully we will then have some time for discussion among ourselves, because I think there are points already on the table that need discussion among the panel, and we, of course, want to get some input from the audience. So, Norbert.
Yes, thank you. And I would like to make a few remarks and try to pick up some of the thoughts and remarks of our colleagues. So we are supposed to talk about the future of Europe and what has changed in February 22 is that the future of Europe, first and foremost, has become a security matter. Before that, we were talking about competitiveness and social inclusion and climate change. This all remains compelling and on the table, but now the future depends on security. What has changed last month, in November this year, is that European security, for the first time since December 1941, has become primarily a European matter. So the future of Europe and the future of European security now, all out of a sudden, depends on us, Europeans. This is fundamentally new, and I think it's fair to say that the Europeans are not prepared for this revolutionary change in their responsibility for their own fate. However, we are now facing the situation. And I would share your slightly positive aspiration that if and when the Europeans are forced to adapt to a new reality, we have the ability to adapt to that. But we simply have to know that it's depending on us. So, what does this mean? This means that it's not only important that this war ends, but it's equally important how it ends. I agree that there will not be a military solution, but I'm absolutely convinced that any political solution and even the availability, achievability of a political solution has military preconditions. What is of paramount interest for us Europeans and the future perspective of security is that we see clearly our strategic goal to make this war a failure. Because if this war, the Russian-Putin war, were to be and turn out to be a success, even to some degree, if there were a reward for war, war would remain. This would be the lesson. Not only that would be drawn out of a successful war in Europe and beyond Europe, that the attempt to reintroduce war as an instrument of foreign policy in Europe in the 21st century succeeded. So our goal is to make this war a failure. To make this war a failure does not imply any notion of territory, but it implies the notion of sovereignty. So what we have to work on is to work for the provisions that Ukraine emerges as a sovereign country, as a viable state out of this war. This is absolutely important because Putin's intentions, why he started the war, have remained and will remain. This is his ambition, his historic mission to re-establish Russia as a European empire. He has never put up with the outcome of the Cold War. He wants to reverse history, and if Ukraine were not to emerge as a sovereign, viable country, the end of the war would quite likely turn out to be only a tactical halt, a tactical pause, to enable Putin to reorganize, to replenish his stockpiles, and then restart the war. So this is of paramount interest. The election of Trump means that we don't know how American foreign and Ukraine policy will evolve. I think this unpredictability as a pattern of his behavior is what we can take for sure, that we don't know anything really. However, we have to prepare for the future. And so we should take him by his words and should not expect America to deliver any military financial support to Ukraine. So we would have to jump in, we would have to substitute, and in a first period we would have to purchase weapons, produce weapons, purchase weapons. So this is a money question, how to provide for Ukrainian security, which is tantamount to European security. A failure of war in a military term would mean that we have to achieve a real stalemate and not the progressing of the Russian advances. If it turned out that Putin is not able to achieve anything through and by the method of war, this would be a frustrating of the efforts of Putin, and this is achievable, and we have to achieve it. So in the first period, we would have to spend money to purchase weapons, to purchase American weapons, and simultaneously, we as Europeans would be forced to develop a European scaling and dimension of our defense industries. We simply couldn't afford to preserve and continue our national defense industries with the main purpose of creating jobs. We would have to transfer and transform our national defense industries to serve the purpose to provide security instead of national jobs. So this is what we would be forced to do. However, it can be the case that we are surprised by Trump's attempt to, out of his desire for historic greatness, to strike, to cut a deal with Putin. Once he were to start this negotiation, he would certainly feel bound to achieve a result, because he would, of course, sell it at home as a big victory. So he's bound to a result, whereas Putin is free to continue to wage war. So Trump would be, from the start, in a weaker position to concede the outcome, in major elements of the outcome, to Russians and Putin's favor. So this is a major threat. I would consider this deal approach by Trump as the worst case scenario for the Europeans, because it would accelerate the process of adaptation for the Europeans, perhaps in a way that would be too quick to adapt, and then we could end up leaving with a deal between Putin and Trump that would be at the cost of Ukrainian security interests, which means at the cost of European security interests, leaving Ukraine as a security gray zone in Europe, and this determining the security situation for years, probably decades to come. So we are facing a very serious situation, and we should have speeded up much more quickly. However, we haven't really started with that, but we certainly have to do, are forced to do it, because there is no alternative. There is only one Europe, it's our Europe, and we have to provide for the future and security of our Europe.
Thank you very much. We only have about 19 minutes left for this entire session. So I'm going to compress it very quickly. I'm going to only ask a couple of questions myself, and then I'm going to open the floor. I want to get some discussion going here on the stage. I see each of you kind of raising your fingers. You have points to make. So I'm just going to mention a couple of points that were made so far. I find it interesting. Metaphors are interesting. We think in metaphors as human beings. So we've got a couple of interesting metaphors on the table here now. One is the metaphor, we heard it from Védrine, of the asteroid that is coming our way, that is going to hit Europe in the form of Trump, and that Europe, together with Canada, are terribly unprepared for what is about to happen. We also have the metaphor of the rhino, which I like very much. I'm very fond of rhinos. But it wasn't entirely clear to me whether the rhino was Trump or Russia.
Deal.
Sorry?
The deal is the rhino.
Deal.
The deal that is the rhino.
In any case, those are two things to keep in mind. I was intrigued by the comment that you made, Norbert, regarding the need for Russia to fail, basically, for this to be a failure for Russia. Russia cannot be allowed to succeed. I want to talk about that, I want to get your reflections on that notion in the context of Trump's promise to end the war very quickly. You know, he's going into office with ending the war being one of his...
On day one.
On day one,
yeah.
Yes. I mean, we can kind of dial back some of the bombast, but he will certainly be putting, that'll be one of his main priorities. So many are wondering how that's going to happen, and if the notion that Europe that territory is not the most important thing, that sovereignty is the most important thing. I find that very interesting. I'm not sure how those things fit together. But I want to get a response from Védrine, because he had you have lots of interesting things to say about this whole question of defense and whether Europe is going to be ready to actually do what it needs to do to stand up for its defense, and that is being put into question. The question that I'm wondering about is how is Trump going to end that war so quickly, and if Europe is going to be forced to give Ukraine the security guarantees because the US is simply not going to do it, it's going to be too preoccupied with Asia, let's say. How is that going to happen? Who wishes to reflect on that? Okay, Zaki, we can start with you. Just briefly, but please, we only have 6 minutes. Let's try to keep it quick.
There is a kind of fascination in Europe vis-à-vis Trump, and we tend to think that he will achieve what he said he will achieve. But let's look at what he achieved during his first mandate, even as someone who's trying to make deals. And virtually, he was not terribly successful as a deal maker. I just remind to this audience that during the Trump administration, the number of American soldiers in Europe has increased during his mandate. It has increased. And I agree with you. The fact that he claims that he's going to find a solution is something. The other thing is how he will do it. And he has to be very cautious, because if he invests politically a lot on Ukraine from the beginning, and if he doesn't achieve his goals, it would be a failure. Third, you have what in the United States, what you call the establishment. The establishment. And the establishment plays a role, including the Pentagon. I mean, he can bypass the Pentagon, but that's not so easy. During his first mandate, he wanted to withdraw American troops in Syria, and he was prevented doing it by the Pentagon. So we need to be cautious. What is sure is that he's not going to vote a new supplemental. But I think that the Biden administration was not going to do it anyway. So I don't think that the difference is going to be huge. We need to be cautious.
Okay. Hubert Védrine.
Alors, deux remarques. D'abord, je pense que Trump va essayer de geler, qui va donc être obligé de dissuader en même temps, sinon il s'affaiblit trop. Et moi, je n'écarte pas l'hypothèse qu'il promette à Poutine la levée des sanctions. C'est dans sa nature, en fait. Et donc, ça placerait les Européens dans une situation extrêmement difficile à gérer, parmi d'autres. Alors, je redis comme tout à l'heure que le point le plus compliqué entre nous, c'est si Trump, il ne peut pas sortir de l'OTAN, mais enfin, il peut donner très peu de garanties américaines, et qu'il dit c'est aux Européens de donner les garanties. Et là, on retombe dans une confusion entre qu'est-ce qui est européen, qu'est-ce qui est OTAN. Et il n'y a pas de structure des alliés européens de l'OTAN. On serait peut-être obligé d'inventer le pôle européen dans l'Alliance Atlantique. Et là, on tombera sur des questions qu'on n'a jamais traitées avant, parce que la question ne se posait pas. C'est qui décide? Qui décide? On n'est pas simplement dans l'industrie d'armement. On n'est pas simplement dans les déclarations. On est dans la guerre et la paix. Donc il faut des décisions politiques d'une légitimité totale. Et on aurait intérêt à réfléchir à ça. On risque dans deuxième remarque très rapide, je pense qu'on ne devrait pas oublier une structure qui a été réinventée par Draghi, l'État, Macron et Scholz, qui est la communauté politique européenne. Je sais que personne n'y croit pour le moment, que ça paraît secondaire, les médias s'en occupent pas, mais c'est le seul rendez-vous où il y a tous les Européens et que les Européens. Bon, ça ne va pas remplacer l'Alliance, mais comme on va avoir des questions à décider entre Européens plus difficiles que depuis 70 ans, il ne faut pas négliger cette instance. Dernier point, vous avez parlé de la perspective à donner à l'Ukraine. que c'est totalement décourageant et dangereux s'il n'y a pas de vraie perspective. L'erreur des Balkans. Il y a un Français qui est M. Bourlange, qui présidait la commission des affaires étrangères française, et qui avait dit il y a quelque temps, s'il y a un blocage dans les décisions européennes, s'il faut de l'unanimité, il faudrait mettre en avant une perspective par étapes. L'adhésion étant l'aboutissement de l'étape, et ne pas tout subordonner au point d'arrivée. Donc les pays qui seraient dans le processus européen, qu'on veut consolider, pour ne pas les désespérer, pour ne pas donner d'arguments aux autres, que ce soit les Russes ou les autres, donc une entrée par étapes dans les différents programmes. Alors ça n'a pas été complètement concrétisé, mais voilà deux idées dont je pense qu'il ne faut pas les oublier. Communauté politique européenne et entrée par étapes.
We have about 11 minutes left. I've developed all sorts of really interesting questions, of course, to put to each of you. But before I open the floor to the audience, I would like to give each of you an opportunity to provide further input if you wish. You've been sitting here next to me very, very quietly and calmly, Yann, but perhaps you wish to reflect from your perspective on what we've just been talking about in terms of security and what the implications are for the private sector, if nothing else.
And I'm going to be a naive guy here since I'm not a foreign policy expert, but my question would be around the effectiveness of NATO, and especially in regards to Article 5, and how, which has never been activated, and
yes, once.
How that, sorry?
But it had been activated once
in
Afghanistan.
9/11.
And how effective it would be even if Ukraine were to join NATO. You know. So that's more.
Now, the purpose of Article 5 is to exist in order not to be activated. Absolutely. So it's deterrence.
Exactly.
And deterrence lives from its credibility. And this is, for the first time, I would say, a real danger, even for the credibility of NATO, if there were this deal, if the leading power of NATO was invented to provide and organize European security. This is why NATO exists, European security. If we now were to witness and experience that the leading power of NATO were to cut a deal with the adversary of Europe at the expense of European security, Article 5 would remain in place, but nevertheless, it would fundamentally damage the credibility of NATO. It would split NATO, because the Central and Eastern Europeans would say, as long as it was about the security of Western Germany and the West, NATO was there, Article 5 was credible. Now it's only about us, the Central and Eastern Europeans, and you let us down. So NATO would not be the same after that deal as it was during the Cold War.
I know you would like to say something. Go ahead.
A bit like Ukraine is not a member, so Article 5 doesn't cover Ukraine. I don't think that Central and Eastern European members of NATO would have such a strong
but they see the security of Ukraine as an imminent threat to their own national security.
But that's not. But the Article 5 is not about imminent threats. Article 5 is about actually attacks. If a member is attacked, I think we generally, as Europeans, because I consider myself a European, despite the fact that I'm not from a country that is in the European Union. I think we should spend, in my opinion, more energy talking to the other side.
The other side being?
You call it adversary, but they're very much part of the future security situation, be it a catastrophe or not a catastrophe in our continent, right?
You're referring to
because
Russia.
What you said, yeah,
right?
I'm talking about Russia.
Yeah.
Because you said, like, what we must not do is to let a pause be just like a holdout for another Putin's invasion so that he can replenish the stocks, prepare, and then invade again. Well, do you believe that this is exactly what they think about the West and Ukraine? And they even quote Madame Merkel when she said, well, Minsk was actually just buying time for Ukraine, the Minsk agreement buying time for Ukraine so that Ukraine can rearm and the like. So the Russians are saying, well, we don't want to hold out so that they can just like rearm them now that Europe is going to bring up this defense spending and the like. So we're talking past each other in Europe. I think we should be talking more to each other. And this is the last thing that I'm going to say. I recently organized a debate between people who have very, very different views. One was Ian Bremmer, and the other one was Sergei Karaganov. So they sat and they talked. They viscerally disagreed about certain things, but then they came up to an understanding that they agree on 90% of things.
That's a lot.
Yeah.
Let's leave it there. We're going to bring in the audience. The questions of what defines success for Ukraine, what defines failure for Russia, what defines success for Europe, all big questions. We have some questions from the floor. We're going to begin here in the second row on the end, and then we're going to go 2 rows back, and then we'll go to the center.
Michel Fouché, I have a question for Norbert Röttgen.
Just please identify yourself quickly.
Michel Fouché. Let's assume that there is a ceasefire in Ukraine. Will the Bundestag accept to send German troops along with French, Polish, British, Italian troops as interposing forces to protect precisely what you said rightly, Ukrainian sovereignty, and to avoid a kind of Minsk III, a stupid agreement? I'm referring to what Hubert Védrine did with Joschka Fischer 20 years ago on Kosovo. Bundestag changed his view on Kosovo. So what do you think?
So it's a difficult question. I tried nevertheless to be brief. I will be brief. The difference between Kosovo and the Russian-Ukrainian border is that the Russian-Ukrainian border as a land border and a sea border is more than 2,000 kilometers. So if we talk about a protective, whatever, European United Nations force, I'm not a military person, but I would think this requires a lot of troops, perhaps 100,000, not that far away from that. This would absorb our resources. We would be the play element for Putin to provoke, so we have to enforce this. So this only, for me, shows, it gives a hint of what the costs will be, probably, if you continue to insufficiently support and equip Ukraine. My conviction is that it's only Ukraine that is able to protect its borders, and for that purpose, for that European purpose, we should support the Ukrainians. If we continue to do this sufficiently, we will have to bear much higher costs, which probably overstretch us. So we should do everything to avoid that this question really enters the German Bundestag to be decided upon.
Védrine, a quick remark.
En quelques secondes. D'abord, la remarque de M. Röttgen est très juste. Mais j'ajoute une question. Est-ce qu'on peut imaginer qu'on envoie des troupes allemandes, françaises, anglaises, sans un vote des parlements? C'est pas évident. Constitutionnellement, j'en sais rien. Politiquement, c'est impossible. Donc il faudrait un vote clair dans le cadre d'un...
Very difficult to get consensus indeed. So, yes, the microphone there to the lady.
Yes, good morning. Daphne Benoit with the AFP, Agence France Presse. First of all, just a quick note, Mr. Jeremić, I greatly appreciated your very honest comments on the perspective of EU adhesion for Ukraine, because frankly, that's what I've been hearing behind closed doors from a lot of European diplomats. I would like to have your perspective, your opinion on the possibility of military aggression by Russia of the Baltic countries, because that would be the ultimate test for the Article 5. Do you think that's a possibility even like a quick incursion would be a huge test for NATO. Thank you.
Just a quick remark on that, because we are trying to focus on a couple of other things, but go ahead quickly if you like.
You're asking me if this is...
Yeah, yeah, that was directed towards you. It's the question about, yeah.
I don't have access to information as much as some other people do. I mean, Norbert's like a president of a committee in the German parliament. Is that possible or not?
It's a hypothetical, I think, on that question regarding whether Russia, if they were to invade the Balkans, even just briefly, what the consequences.
The Balkans? Balkans? I can assure you that they cannot invade the Balkans, but...
Baltic.
The Baltics.
Oh, the Baltics.
Les Baltics. Les Baltes.
Sorry. Yeah.
I mean, the Baltics are covered by the NATO guarantee, so exactly. no question about this.
But if you go to the Baltic countries, it feels very different there. It must be said.
But if you allow me, there was a reference to Ukraine, and you mentioned NATO and the EU membership. There are two things which are really different. I have absolutely no doubt that Ukraine will at some point join the EU, but of course not in the next 5 years, and this is a point we've made clear to President Zelensky on the timeline of joining the European Union. But in my view, the best guarantee the European Union could offer to Ukraine is membership.
Okay,
thank you. I must push back on that. 25 years ago, I was one of the founders of the resistance movement as a student that overthrew Milosevic in the year 2000. Mm-hmm. And I really did believe, after we overthrew Milosevic, that we were going to join the European Union. Mm-hmm. And that was 25 years ago. And now I'm not going to get into why and whose fault and was it possible, not possible, never mind. Was it history or doesn't matter. 25 years later, we're not in the European Union. And we are a less complicated place than Ukraine. So we're talking many decades. I think what you said, although I understand what you said because I'm a diplomat, so I understand diplomatic language, Ukrainian public reads what you say as, we are joining by the end of the decade. And that's not going to happen.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely, but it's not because the Ukrainians think this that it's going to happen. But at the same time, we still need to keep the option open.
Okay, this is a debate that's going to continue. We have one more question, and then we're going to wrap it up. We've got three hands in the air and no more time, so I'm not sure how to proceed. This was the first person I saw along with the other two.
Stan Cosmo, Capgemini. One comment and one question. Comment is, I believe, to be on Hubert's remark on reaching EU by steps, that one way to make Putin fail is to publicly say that Ukraine will, by step, like maybe Serbia and other countries, ultimately one day, without no date, of course, join the EU. Second question is about which countries do you believe are most likely to be ready to invest in military support to the ceasefire, which is likely to happen with Trump? Don't you think that geography plays a key role, such as Poland being very close to Baltic countries, Finland with 1,300 kilometers of border? Don't you think these countries will have a vested interest to make something?
Thank you. And one reply from the panel, and then we're going to have to wrap it up. Who would like to respond to that? Hubert Védrine.
J'ai pas la réponse, mais ça concerne des pays qui sont motivés politiquement et qui ont des moyens militaires. Il y en a pas 27. Hein. Donc ça concerne un petit nombre de pays. Après, ça dépend du cadre général qui va être créé par Trump. Et après, on tombe sur les remarques de M. Röttgen, très juste, sur le fait que ce sont des cibles toutes désignées. Si on est dans un cadre où Trump n'a pas réussi à dissuader suffisamment Poutine, s'il veut réattaquer, je ne vois pas pourquoi il attaquerait l'ensemble du système, alors que le système est maintenant mobilisé, réarmé, renforcé, et je ne peux pas le démontrer. S'il y a un Polonais, je ne peux pas lui démontrer qu'il n'y a pas d'attaque. mais on retomberait dans la question de on appelle ça, c'est la chèvre au piquet. Je ne sais pas si ça se traduit bien. Si on envoie les 4-5 pays, envoie des troupes en Ukraine, c'est par là que l'attaque va recommencer, en fait. Pour tester la résistance, non pas de l'article 5, parce qu'on n'est pas dans l'article 5, mais la capacité politique dans chacun des pays concernés, 5 ou 6, à tenir bon. Vous voyez le piège. Donc il faut trouver une solution.
I'm so sorry, we're way out of time, and I've gone over, and I must apologize to our next panel that I've taken more time than I should. But thank you to you all. I'm very sorry we couldn't take any more questions. Thanks very much to our panelists. A warm round of applause.